Did Sauron in any way become more powerful than Morgoth, or did he have more success in the subjugation of the world as compared to his master? Here in this video we will explore this hot topic and come to an answer, or hopefully cooling off the debate. Let's begin with an excerpt from Morgoth's Ring, Notes on Motives in the Silmarillion. So in the words of Tolkien himself, Sauron was greater effectively in the Second Age than Morgoth at the end of the First. Why? Because though he was smaller, far smaller by natural stature, he had not yet fallen so low. Eventually, he also squandered his power of being in the endeavor to gain control of others. But he was not obliged to expend so much of himself. To gain domination over Arda, Morgoth had let most of his being pass into the physical constituents of the earth. Hence, all things that were born on earth and lived on and by it, whether beasts or plants or incarnate spirits, were liable to be stained. Morgoth at the time of the War of the Jewels had become permanently incarnate. For this reason, he was afraid and waged the war almost entirely by means of devices or by subordinates and dominated creatures. Melkor, whose name means he who arises in might, was one of the original Valar created by Eru Ilúvatar at the beginning of time, and he was stated to be the greatest of all the Ainur in the beginning. But early on, during the music of creation itself, Melkor began to rebel, injecting his own ideas, dark ideas, into the unfolding world. So Melkor was no doubtly the most powerful and was the only one of the Ainur that was granted sight to all of Eru Ilúvatar's final plans for the world. This gave him pride and a feeling of supremacy in what can be likened to the Luciferian tale. He thus spent his powers in corrupting the world and Eru's children, who eventually gave him a new name of Morgoth, meaning the dark enemy of the world. One of Melkor's most terrifying abilities was his power to corrupt others, bending them to his will. He used this to twist many of the Mire spirits into his servants, transforming some into Balrogs and others like Sauron into his chief lieutenants. Melkor also understood the power of fear as a tool of control. He sought to rule by sowing terror and dread, making resistance seem futile. As the dark enemy, he created an atmosphere where his mere presence or the rumor of his return will instill fear and terror. His physical presence in Middle-earth, especially during the First Age, radiated his palpable fear and despair, affecting all elves, men, and even other Maiar. But his main strength wasn't in raw might, but in his deep foundational influence over creation. Unlike other beings who exerted their will over the natural world, Melkor embedded his essence into Arda itself. This act bound him to the world, diffusing his power across all of Middle-earth. But it came at a cost. By dispersing his spirit in this way, he diminished his individual strength over time. However, it also meant that Arda, in a sense, was forever tainted by Melkor's presence, and his malice lingers even after his defeat and exile. The corruption he wrought permeated rocks, storms, beasts, and even some creatures of spirit, creating an enduring legacy of evil. If this is a little confusing, we can explain this in some sort of a timeline perspective. So in the very beginning, Melkor was the greatest of all the Ainur, including the Valar. He was granted sight to Eru's plans, all of it. He was second only to Eru Ilúvatar himself. When the Ainulindale, the creation of Arda, began, he twisted his theme and thus started to pour in his own essence and corrupt the world, losing a lot of power there. By the time of the destruction of the two lambs, in the Elder Days, he had become physically weaker than Tulkas, as described in him losing the fight, and was chained by the Valar to be brought forth for judgment in front of Manwë, who was second in power to him originally. He was still a Valar, Melkor, and was one of the most powerful even at this time. He was then imprisoned for 3 ages long while the world around him went on and his dark servants await his return. After his release and the destruction of the 2 trees, Melkor was in fact somewhat vulnerable to even Ungoliant, who had fed on the lights of the trees of Valinor and needed the Balrogs to help free him from the her webs of unlight. It is here during this age when he corrupted and created the first of the vile orcs breeds and the trolls, dragons, all sorts of evil corrupted beings, phantoms and beings of shadow, that his essence was greatly expended. It was during the War of Wrath that even an elf like Fingolfin was able to wound him 7 times, and he was finally overpowered, well implied to be, by a powerful Maiar called Eonwë, the herald of Manwë. Thus here at the end of his tale in the First Age, he was essentially weaker than even a Maiar, having fallen so low from the highest place in creation. So when he was defeated and cast out of the world, Sauron, who was still hiding in fear from Morgoth's wrath after failing in holding the fort of Túrin Turambar, saw his chance to take on Morgoth's place as the new Dark Ruler of Middle-earth. There was no other dark creature or spirit in Middle-earth that was even close to him in power. The greatest of the dragons and a lot of the Balrogs had been vanquished, so there he stood alone as the next Dark Lord. He succeeded greatly in this and gradually took control of all of Middle-earth and even Numenor, and except for a few places like Lindon or Rivendell, Sauron became its Dark Ruler. With the creation of the One Ring, his powers were amplified many times, and it was only at the cost of countless thousands and the lives of both High King Gil-galad and Elendil. In the War of the Last Alliance was the evil of Sauron temporarily abated. So when talking in terms of raw strength or magical and spiritual power, Sauron is nowhere close to Melkor in the beginning of the world. He was still afraid of Morgoth in the end stages of the War of Wrath. However, in his ages of toiling under Aule the Smith, he had discovered a way to create a device to amplify his powers and his reach. So in the year 1600 of the Second Age, at the steps of Mount Doom, Sauron created the One Ring, which not only commanded subjugation from the other lesser rings of power, but also enhances the wearer's might. The ring is a tool of domination and enhances the bearer's natural abilities. It might have allowed Aragorn, for example, to inspire people to follow him as he became the next great dictator. In the books, Gandalf describes this process if he were to claim the ring, that he would build up a great kingdom to overthrow Sauron militarily and replace him as Middle-earth's new tyrant. And so for Sauron, the ring was an amplifier of his dark powers, and he became a more powerful being with this. Here, Sauron's might and power would have rivaled that of Morgoth at the end of the First Age, when Morgoth was at his weakest. But in another way, Sauron was greater in that he was far more freer than his master, who had passed on his essence or being into the very earth itself, and was thus permanently incarnate, unlike Sauron, who could shift into his spirit form and back to physical form at any given time. Sauron's military victories in the Second Age also eclipsed that of his master. While Morgoth struggled against a more powerful First Age army of elves, men and the host of the Valar, he never really conquered much of Beleriand. Just the northern wastes below the Iron Mountains, Thangorodrim, Angband, Utumno and parts of the Elven realms in the north of Beleriand. While Sauron, facing against a weaker force in the Second Age, comparatively speaking, was able to take over all of the lands of Middle-earth except for Lindon and Rivendell. He also managed to corrupt Numenor and was only defeated in the War of the Last Alliance. So by area of conquest, Sauron was a greater military leader. So that is what we think Tolkien might have meant by saying Second Age Sauron was effectively greater than Morgoth at the end of the First Age. Not physically or spiritually, but more of having more degrees of freedom and military successes. And with that, we come to the end of the video. So support us by liking this video and sharing or subscribing to get more videos on Middle-earth later on. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Take care, fam.